Assalamualaikum. The author argues that many of the major global conflicts and political events of the 20th century were driven by a hidden agenda, the pursuit and control of oil. The Anglo-American interests have used the economic and military power to secure control over the world's oil reserves. This has been the primary motive behind events ranging from World War I to more recent conflicts in the Middle East. The author discusses how oil has been used as a geopolitical weapon. Oil is not just a commodity, but a crucial instrument of world domination. He traces the history of how the UK and later the US realized that controlling oil gives them unparalleled power over other countries' economies and military capabilities. The book presents a revisionist history suggesting that the conventional explanations for major wars and political upheavals are incomplete. It argues that oil interests and financial cartels have often operated covertly, influencing or even instigating conflicts to maintain the economic and political dominance. A significant part of this book focuses on the post-World War I era and the creation of the petrodollar system, which mandates that oil must be traded in US dollars. This system was a deliberate strategy to ensure global demand for the dollar, strengthening US economic hegemony and allowing it to exert financial control over other nations. The author provides specific historical examples to support his claims. For instance, he links the UK's actions in World War I to its desire to secure Middle Eastern oil supplies. Much later on, the overthrow of Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in the 1950s was a move to protect Anglo-American oil control. The author alludes to the idea that the long-term strategies have created a global power structure designed to serve a select elite. He suggests that this system relies on military intervention, financial manipulation, and even psychological operations to maintain its control. This book gives several examples of Anglo-American meddling in other countries to secure or monopolize oil resources. There are often the hidden motives behind major political events. For example, in the early 20th century, Germany planned to build a railway from Berlin to Baghdad. This project was a significant threat to British control of the seas because it would have given Germany direct land access to the oil-rich Middle East, bypassing British naval dominance. Britain's opposition to this railway was a primary, though often unstated reason for its increasing antagonism towards Germany in the years leading up to World War I. The British government saw the railway as a strategic threat to its future access to oil, which was becoming vital for its navy and industrial economy. In the early 1950s, Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which was a British company that controlled Iran's oil. The British government was enraged by the loss of its profitable monopoly and sought to overthrow Mossadegh with the help of the US. The CIA orchestrated a coup d'etat in 1953 through a joint operation known as Operation Ajax. The coup successfully overthrew Mossadegh and restored the Shah to power. Subsequently, the British monopoly was replaced by a consortium of mostly American and British companies, effectively re-establishing foreign control over Iran's oil. The author frames the Suez Crisis as a conflict over energy control. After the US and UK withdrew funding for the Aswan Dam, Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, which is a crucial gateway for shipping oil from the Persian Gulf to Europe. UK and France, in a joint effort with Israel, invaded Egypt to regain control of the canal. The US, however, publicly condemned the invasion and used its financial leverage to force the UK to withdraw its troops. This was the pivotal moment where the US began to supplant UK as the dominant power in the region, asserting its own control over global oil flows. The breakup of Yugoslavia was linked to Anglo-American geopolitical interests, although not directly to oil in the same way as the Middle East. It was more about the strategic control of Europe and maintaining and containing potential rivals. In 1990, the US Congress passed the Foreign Operations Appropriation Law, which provided that any part of Yugoslavia that failed to declare independence from Yugoslavia within 6 months would lose US financial support. It demanded separate elections supervised by the US State Department. The Bush administration demanded the dissolution of the Yugoslav Federation, lighting the fuse for a series of Balkan wars. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, and other Western financial institutions have used economic pressure and structural adjustment programs in the late 1980s and early 1990s to destabilize Yugoslavia's economy. By imposing harsh austerity measures and forcing privatization, these policies exacerbated ethnic and regional tensions, making the country ripe for conflicts. The US is the largest shareholder and a key influencer in IMF. It has been known to use its power to promote policies that it claims would stabilize the country's economy, but have actually harmed developing countries. This influence is often exerted through the conditions attached to IMF loans. The US uses IMF as a tool to dominate the economies of developing countries. Its foreign policy has relentlessly pursued global control over oil and the financial systems that manage it. The IMF is a key instrument in this strategy. Critics have argued that IMF policies are a form of neo-colonialism. Rather than directly invading or colonizing other nations, the US uses IMF to exert control. By forcing countries to open their markets and privatize assets, they create opportunities for multinational corporations from the US and other Western countries to dominate these economies, which benefits the US in its corporate interests at the expense of the developing country's economic sovereignty and social well-being. The author contends that this process is a modern form of financial colonialism, where countries are kept in a state of perpetual economic dependence. Here is an example of how IMF policies have devastated developing countries. Yugoslavia's GDP sank by 7.5% in 1990 and another 15% in 1991. Industry production plunged 21%. IMF demanded wholesale privatization of state enterprises, resulting in the bankruptcy of more than 1,000 companies by 1990 and more than 20% unemployment rate. IMF ordered all wages frozen at the 1989 levels, while inflation rose dramatically, causing real earnings to fall 41% by the first 6 months of 1990. By 1991, inflation was over 140%. The IMF plays a direct role in the Anglo-American strategy for controlling global energy resources. Countries with significant oil or other strategic resources are partially susceptible to this type of financial pressure. By controlling a nation's economy through debt and imposed policies, the US can ensure favorable access to its resources and prevent the company from aligning with rival powers. The IMF is a non-military arm of a broader geopolitical strategy to maintain global hegemony by controlling resources and finance. I learned a few new facts from this book. Did you know that the US not only played a role in overthrowing Mossadegh and reinstalling the Shah, but also later played a role in Khomeini's coming to power? I took a while to process some of the information in this book. I'm no longer surprised by the evil and greed of the elite who would do anything to secure their interest, influence, and profits. They don't care what pain they inflict on ordinary people, most of whom are clueless about the power game that the elite plays. This book is definitely a must-read. You can get it using the link in the description. If you like listening to me babbling about books, please subscribe and turn on notification. Thank you. Assalamualaikum. This book critically explores Muslim identity, political sovereignty, and the concept of the caliphate in the post-colonial era. It discusses the decline of the caliphate and its implication for the Muslim world, especially in the context of colonialism and post-colonialism. It examines the historical, political, and cultural significance of the caliphate, which was abolished in 1924 by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of modern Turkey. Rather than viewing it as merely a historical institution, it examines how the idea of the caliphate represents Muslim self-determination and alternative political imagination. The author argues that the caliphate serves as a symbol of Muslim political agency and an alternative to Western-dominated global order. The end of the caliphate marked a profound shift in the Muslim world, leading to a crisis of authority and identity. He examines how the colonial powers exploited this vacuum to impose their systems of governance and control, thus shaping the modern world order. He criticizes the contemporary global political system, which is dominated by Western norms and values, often at the expense of Muslim societies. He critiques how Western hegemony has shaped global political discourse, marginalizing Muslim political aspirations. Up to the last quarter of the previous century, Islam was expected to dissipate as the global advance of westernization brought secularization and modernization. Not only has Islam failed to follow the trajectory of confining it to the private sphere and demilitarization, it has, on the contrary, forcefully reasserted its public presence in the world. This book discusses how Islamist movements challenge secularism and the Western nation-state model. It places Muslim political struggles within the broader context of world order, questioning how power is distributed globally. It is a theoretical and post-colonial critique that offers a fresh perspective on Islam's role in contemporary geopolitics. The author calls for a rethinking of the caliphate not as a return to a medieval institution, but as a symbol of resistance against Western hegemony and a means of reasserting Muslim agency in global affairs. He suggests that the concept of the caliphate can serve as a framework for imagining alternative forms of political and social organization that are more inclusive and just. This book wouldn't be complete without discussing the challenges of re-establishing the caliphate, but not in the sense of returning to the historical model. It explores the deeper political, ideological, and structural obstacles that are preventing Muslims from asserting a unified political agency on the global stage. I'm going to highlight only 3 of the challenges discussed in this book. First, colonial legacies and nation-states. The modern world is structured around the nation-state system, which was largely imposed on Muslim-majority regions during and after colonial rule. This system fragments Muslim political unity and reinforces Western dominance in global politics. The abolition of the caliphate was a pivotal moment in the decline of Muslim political power and the rise of Western-dominated global order. Re-establishing the caliphate would require overcoming the legacy of colonialism, which fragmented Muslim societies and imposed Western political systems. This fragmentation makes it difficult to unify Muslim-majority regions under one political entity. Second, Western hegemony and Islamophobia. Western powers have continued to marginalize Muslim political aspirations, often portraying any attempt to reimagine Muslim governance outside the Western nation-state model as extremist or a threat to world order. Third, diverse interpretation of the caliphate. One of the major challenges is the lack of consensus among Muslims about what the caliphate should look like in the modern world. The caliphate is often romanticized or idealized, but its historical reality was complex and contested. Different groups have varying interpretation of its role, structure, and relevance, making it difficult to achieve a unified vision. Muslims are not united on what a political reassertion of Islam should look like. Differences in sectarian, national, and ideological perspectives make it difficult to conceptualize a unified caliphate. The author does not offer a step-by-step solution to the challenges, but he proposes ways to rethink Muslim political agency in the post-colonial framework. He is more concerned with how Muslims can reclaim political subjectivity rather than prescribing a specific political system. I'm going to highlight only 3 of the proposed solutions. First, reimagine Muslim political identity. Muslims need to move beyond the constraints of Western political models such as nation-state and secularism and develop a political identity rooted in Islamic traditions and history. Second, reimagine the caliphate as a symbol of resistance. The caliphate should not be understood as a literal return to a historical institution, but as a symbolic framework for challenging Western hegemony and reasserting Muslim agency. This involves using the idea of the caliphate to inspire unity and resistance against oppressive global structure and focusing on the caliphate as a metaphor for justice, equality, and self-determination rather than a specific political identity. Third, decolonize Muslim thought and politics. The author emphasizes the need to decolonize Muslim societies by rejecting the imposed frameworks of the nation-state and Western political systems. This would involve developing alternative political and economic models that are rooted in Islamic principles but adapted to modern realities. It should also encourage intellectual and cultural movements that challenge Eurocentric narratives and reclaim Islamic heritage. Overall, this book is thought-provoking and challenges readers to reconsider the historical and contemporary relevance of the caliphate in the context of global power dynamics and the quest for decolonization. Instead of advocating for a restoration of the historical caliphate, it examines how Muslims can assert political subjectivity in a world shaped by colonial Muslims can assert political subjectivity in a world shaped by colonial legacies. You can get this book using the link in the description. There is also a link to an interview with the author. If you like listening to me babbling about books, please subscribe and turn on notification. Thank you. Assalamualaikum. Zionism began as an evangelical Christian project. It is a religious appeal to help and prepare for the return of the Jews to Palestine to establish a Jewish state as the fulfillment of God's will. Later, the Christians involved in this campaign politicized the theology of return when they realized that a similar movement had emerged among European Jews who despaired of finding a solution to anti-Semitism in Europe. The Christian desire to see a Jewish Palestine coincided with a similar European Jewish vision in the late 19th century. Subsequently, it gave birth to lobby groups to gather support for a Jewish homeland. When Theodor Herzl started spreading his idea for a Jewish state, the impoverished working-class Jews were very receptive to his idea, while the elite Jews remained aloof. The latter had no reason to abandon their comfortable life in Europe. Herzl looked down on the former and denigrated them, but realized they were more amenable to moving to Palestine. Ilan Pappy critically examines the evolution, influence and activities of pro-Israel lobby groups, particularly in the US. He traces the origin of Zionist lobbies back to the 19th century and highlights the collaboration between Christian Zionists who wanted to hasten the Second Coming and Jewish Zionists who wanted to help European Jews escape anti-Semitism. Together, they persuaded the British government to support the establishment of a Jewish state, culminating in the Balfour Declaration in 1917. Balfour had no sympathy for the plight of Jews. In 1905, he supported the Aliens Act to stop an influx of Jews fleeing the pogroms of Eastern Europe. Some scholars suspect he was actually driven by anti-Semitism. He did not want more Jewish immigrants in Britain. Herzl himself repeatedly told the British and Germans that the Zionist colonization of Palestine would divert the dreaded Jewish immigrants from Western Europe to Palestine. Herzl suggested that a Jewish state could serve not only British interests in Asia, but those of the Western world. According to him, it would be in the interest of the civilized nations to have a cultural station in Asia. A Jewish state would contribute an element of stability to Asian politics. This book discusses how the Zionist lobby groups have shaped US foreign policy in favor of Israel. It explores the historical context, strategies, and impacts of the lobbying activities, arguing that they often prioritize Israel's interests over US interests and broader considerations of peace and justice in the Middle East. Here is an example of how AIPAC influenced US foreign policy. AIPAC began lobbying for US to invade Iraq in December 2001 until it was approved by Congress in 2002. It hinted that Yasser Arafat was among those behind the 9/11 attack. Years later, the 9/11 Commission report stated that there was no evidence to support the allegation. AIPAC collaborated with the Israeli government, neocons, and Christian Zionists to make the invasion of Iraq possible, resulting in a series of catastrophes: civil war, state collapse, refugee crisis, and the rise of ISIS. After World War II, the neocons joined After World War II, the neocons joined forces with Christian and Jewish Zionists in the US to advocate for Israel as a bulwark against communism. The author discusses the method the lobby groups use to influence policy makers, including exerting pressure on Congress, suppressing dissent within political parties, and conducting smear campaigns against critics. They also secured military aid for Israel and pushed for the recognition of unlawfully occupied territories, often denying Palestinian rights. The author highlights the cognitive dissonance among 20th century Zionist advocates as they justified increasing violence against Palestinians. The Zionist lobby groups have shaped the political culture in the US and UK, affecting politicians' ability to address Israel's abuses of Palestinians. When politicians or public figures refuse to support Israel or criticizes Israeli policies, the lobby employs various strategies to marginalize them. For example, Jeremy Corbyn, the US Labour Party leader, was labeled as an anti-Semite, leading to him being ousted in 2020. The lobby groups have used many tactics to pressure, discredit, or sideline politicians and advocates who refuse to support Israel. Among the tactics are smear campaigns and accusations of anti-Semitism, political pressure and intimidation, censorship and career damage, intervention in elections, loss of institutional support, and manipulating legislative and legal actions. These tactics create a chilling effect, discouraging people from openly debating and criticizing Israeli policies, regardless of their personal beliefs or human rights concerns. This is especially the case in the US, where supporting Israel is seen as a bipartisan issue. The author proposes several ways to counter the lobby's influence. Among steps that can be taken are raising public awareness by promoting open debate and education, countering the criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic, grassroots activism and political pressure, breaking the political consensus, reforming campaign finance, holding politicians accountable, and supporting alternative voices, challenging media bias, and international solidarity. The author believes that dismantling the lobby's power requires persistent public pressure, strategic political engagement, and a commitment to upholding free speech and human rights. At the beginning of the book, the author poses this question: why does Israel still lobby for its legitimacy more than 7 decades after its establishment? Defenders of Israel are constantly beset by self-doubt about the state's legitimacy, fueling the campaign to justify a project and later state that could only be founded and sustained by the constant oppression of another nation. They react strongly to Israel's critics because they know the critics have a point, and they cannot deny it. Sykes and his compatriots in the British War Cabinet had one thing in common when committing to an Anglo-Zionist Palestine. They knew practically nothing about Palestine. Politicians were reluctant to support a Zionist project, were aware it would be unpopular with Palestinians. Prominent Jews dreaded the impact of the project on the Anglo-Jewish community as a whole, but had no regard for the Palestinian lives it would affect. What has transpired in the past 18 months is a testament to the far-reaching influence of the Zionist lobby. Despite refutable, mounting evidence of a genocide, critics of Israel continues to be silenced on all platforms. I like Ilan Pappy's writing style. It flows nicely and is easy to understand. You can get this book using the link in the description. There is also a link to the author talking about this book. If you like listening to me babbling about books, please subscribe and turn on notification. Thank you. Assalamualaikum. Iraq, The Grape of a Country by Terry Gardner. The author was a British businessman with interests in the Middle East. He had been working there for 2 decades. He was in Bahrain when the US and UK coalition force was about to invade Iraq. Concerned for the safety of his Iraqi employees in Baghdad, he decided to travel there despite many persuading him not to. After much difficulty, he arrived in Basra before heading to Baghdad amid the bombing. This book is his testimony. The author was informed by his contacts in the military that Saddam was given the green light to invade Kuwait in 1990 by George Bush Sr. The American ambassador to Iraq told Saddam that the US regarded the quarrel between Iraq and Kuwait as a local difficulty and would accept whatever Saddam decided to do. Little did Saddam know that they were setting a trap for him. Iraqis suffered 12 years of sanctions starting from 1991. There were shortages of medical supplies, food, and other essential commodities. The sanction had no effect on the Saddam and his close associates, but the people suffered and they blamed the West for their hardships. Many Iraqis had no love for Saddam, but they hated the Americans and British more. From 1992 onwards, the American and British military bombed Iraq regularly. Even before the 2003 invasion, Iraqis endured years of suffering with over 400,000 deaths due to bombing campaigns by the British and Americans. The US later admitted it carried out up to 12 bombing missions a month on Iraq from 1998 to 2002. At a cost of $750,000 per mission. There was no way Iraqis who had endured years of sustained bombing would welcome the Americans and British as liberators. Shortly before the invasion in 2003, almost everyone the author spoke to expressed reservation about it. Saddam started the first war, but this time, there was no justification because Kuwait had built a good trading partnership with Iraq since 1990 and it had been peaceful since. Many soldiers in Iraq whom he spoke to questioned the legality of Bush and Blair's action, even though they were prepared for war. Before the invasion, Shia and Sunni Muslims and other religion groups lived together peacefully, making the country governable. Many tribes had a mix of Shia and Sunnis. There were many churches throughout Iraq attended by Iraqi Christians. In fact, Saddam's right-hand man was a practicing Christian. Each community had strong bonds with other communities. Everyone looked after one another. Bush and Blair destroyed this traditional way of life, which had been squandered with hatred and fighting between Shia and Sunni groups, while Christians and other groups were ostracized. Under Saddam's rule, Iraqis enjoyed freedom and security. The government provided free education for everyone. Iraqi women had more freedom than women in other Middle Eastern countries. Employment rates was high, with social benefits for the small minority who could not work. Most Westerners were oblivious to this, believing the propaganda that Iraqis were suffering under a tyrannical dictatorship. From the start of the invasion, the coalition force made certain to destroy Iraq's power infrastructure, leaving the population with no electricity and fresh water. The Americans routinely flew Apache helicopters low over residential areas at night. Apparently, that was a standard military practice, a form of psychological warfare to deprive Iraqis of sleep. Do these strategies sound familiar? If the invasion was about toppling a dictator and bringing democracy to Iraq, why were they terrorizing the civilians? Many American soldiers believed they were there to kill Iraqis. Trigger-happy soldiers adopted the shoot first, ask questions later policy, causing the murder of countless innocent civilians. The massacre of civilians in Fallujah in April 2003 was one of many. They have never been held accountable. Then there were arrests of innocent Iraqis who were detained and tortured to extract information about insurgents. Many died of torture. A later survey found that 90% of Iraqis tortured in prison were innocent. When the head of a family was arrested, the loss of the breadwinner caused unbelievable hardship to their families, who grew to hate the coalition force. In 2014, there were an estimated 3 million orphans in Iraq. Most lived on the streets in horrendous conditions. In 2016, a UN report confirmed that 1,496 Iraqi children had been abducted in the past 3 years. Few were seen again. Most had been taken either for sexual exploitation, to raise ransom, or for the trade in human organs. Shortly after the invasion, Bush put Paul Bremer, who had no previous experience of the Middle East, in charge of Iraq. He followed Bush's instruction to the letter and made error after error. Bremer later admitted that the invasion was not thought through and no one anticipated the aftermath. He said that the invasion had unleashed a catastrophe not just for Iraq, but for the Middle East. Later, Bush appointed Ahmad Shalabi as president of Iraq. He had lived in exile in the UK and US for decades. He had a dubious reputation and turned out to be the one who spread false information about Iraq's WMD to suit his personal ambition. American soldiers who initially believed what their government told them found a different reality after arriving in Iraq. Iraqis did not want them there. Many became disillusioned and deserted. They simply walked through the border posts of neighboring countries. The US had never given an accurate account of how many did so. Experts on the Middle East, including retired British diplomats, warned Blair that occupying Iraq and imposing Western-style democracy was doomed to fail because of the country's strong tribal culture. They advised that the invasion would result in a catastrophe. In 2002, the CIA told Bush that the documents alleging that Saddam was trying to buy uranium from Africa were false. Joseph Wilson, a former ambassador, went to Niger to check the claims and found the documents to be forgeries. Hans Blakes, the chief weapons inspector, informed Blair that there was no WMD in Iraq just 2 days before the invasion. As the war progressed, it became clear that the invasion was not just to force regime change, but to break down and weaken Iraq's traditional, centuries-old tribal system, allowing the coalition to engineer a civil war to control and manipulate the Iraqis, thus giving them control of Iraq's oil and mineral resources. Do you know the story about how and where Saddam was captured in December 2003? That official story was a lie. Iraqis knew that Saddam had been captured 1 month earlier. The rest of the world swallowed that lie, hook, line, and sinker. You can get this book using the links in the description. There is also a link to a video of the author introducing this book. If you like listening to me babbling about books, please subscribe and turn on notification. Thank you.